Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining. It's a real pleasure to have you all. It's a remarkable list of attendees this morning, and I just wanted to provide a little bit of background on the IFB, the series we're launching here, and to really just hand it off to the experts. IFB, we started about 18 years ago, and since then, remarkable things have happened. We are now we've convened over 650 sessions. We are at 50 chapters around the world. We are at almost 6,000 members. This is remarkable, and it's all happening quite organically. Where there's a need, people are convening and forming these chapters. Just a matter of procedure. Today, we're going to be putting your questions, please, in the chat. There are going to be a number of them. Some we will get to today, some we will get to over the course of the next 3 series after this, and others you will linger and you'll want to ask again, and I'm happy to put you in touch with Joe or Hari or both. Please let me know. My email address is in the chat. My name is Kayvon. I am the head of Impact for Breakfast. So before we start, just a quick story. About 20 years ago, I was sitting on a rooftop terrace outside of Washington, D.C. with a friend in conservation, and he turned to me and he said, just looking out at the landscape before us, he said, "What crazy set of decisions led to this outcome?" And we just sat there and just kind of ruminated on it. Well, the 2 panelists today, Joe and Hari, don't just ruminate. They pan out to awareness and see the whole picture. They understand it, they understand its complexities, and then they dive in meticulously to understand every aspect of it and how they interlink with each other and where different coordination and support is needed. So this morning, we're going to be launching this series, Making Complexity Investable, the Plastics Transition as a Systemic Case. This particular session is called Nature, Risk, and Dependency, Setting the Systemic Context. Session 2 that we will launch shortly, should be happening in the next 2 to 3 weeks, is all about microplastics, the impacts on the environment, all the ecosystems within it, and human health. So we're going to look at that in great depth. Session 3 is the transition. We're talking about a transition away from plastics in this particular case. There are people doing it, and you should know about what they're doing and how they plug in the holistic solution that we seek. And then session 4 will be all about putting the pieces back together again. We're going to walk together, and it's important that we land at the same place. So these conversations are, in fact, conversations. So unfortunately, because of the size of the group, we do ask that you put your questions in the chat, but there will be a good 30 to 40 minutes at the end of the session focused entirely on answering your questions. With that, I will hand it over to Joe and Hari to introduce themselves and to give you context. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kayvon. First and foremost, thanks to Impact for Breakfast for the gracious invitation to be here. Really excited about this 4-part series and getting to know kind of the group around the table here, but also more learning around impact investing and systemic investing. So the first thing I'll say is that several challenges in the world need systemic solutions, especially those that relate to the environment. Now, I understand that when we talk about impact investing or systemic solutions or complexity, a lot of us get paralyzed. So the purpose of this 4-part series, and I think Impact for Breakfast more broadly, is to demystify impact and systemic and complexity. And hopefully we can take you on a journey to do that. I want to set some clear expectations up front. And Kayvon mentioned that we want this to be a dialogue and conversation. There's many people around the table, so it's hard to do in real time, but comments, interjections are welcome. For any of you that have been in a session with me in person or around a table, you'll have heard this before. But no session that I am a part of is free, and no meal is free. We're at a breakfast right now. This breakfast isn't free, so you're requested to and encouraged to participate. Not only that, if we don't have participation, I'll encourage it. Nobody's safe, so if we don't have dialogue, I'll force it. So just be warned. I'll also say that, Keyvan said he'll turn to the experts. And yes, we've been thinking about this for many years. I've been in this space for over 2 decades, and I'll give a bit of my story in a second. However, by no means do we have the answers. Now, I think there's a pathway to simplify the complexity and systemic nature of what we need to do around climate and nature, but we need all hands on deck. So what I'm really, really excited by is the people that have been encouraged to come to this session. Hopefully more will join in the future sessions in this 4-part series, and that we can learn together. I'm a constant student, and I look forward to learning from all of you. So what is my story? I come from an environmental background, started in marine conservation, then more generally in conservation. In fact, I met Keyvan about 20 years ago in the conservation community. And I had a tremendous learning opportunity and learned from the 3 greatest teachers in the world. And those are people, so conservationists that I learned, I stand on the shoulder of giants in the conservation sector. Communities at the front lines of nature and climate disaster, and that's indigenous communities and local people around the world that have solutions that don't see the light of day on Wall Street in the City of London. And experience. And I've had the great fortune of working through and living and working across 350 projects in over 55 countries around the world in the climate and nature space. Now, we're going to talk about plastics, and we'll get into that as a case for systemic investing, but I want to set the backdrop a little bit more broadly on climate and nature. So many of us have heard here, and I won't go into detail, about the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention. Now, for a long time, when I started my career over 20 years ago, we did a lot of work in climate and nature without super clear direction or targets or understanding of the magnitude of the challenge. That all changed in the 2010s. In 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, which set a clear target for climate. In 2022, we had the Montreal Kunming Agreement, the biodiversity framework that set a target for nature. So the climate agreement, the Paris Agreement, is 1.5 degree future, which we will surpass. We have surpassed, but there's still a chance to limit it to under 2 degrees. The biodiversity framework, put simply, is 30 by 30, and it has 3 main components: protect 30% of the planet, restore 30% of critically degraded habitat, and sustainably manage the rest in timberlands, agricultural lands, and landscapes and oceans around the world by 2030, and that's the second 30. Now, both of these have clear targets within the frameworks. They also have an explanation of the financing required, the activities required to get to those targets, and what it will cost. And that's something that we didn't have when I started my career. So I am an investor now, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm an advisor, but I'm all of those things purely by accident and pragmatism. My core focus is helping to achieve the targets. First, setting the frame. So I worked on creating the biodiversity framework and the climate framework, setting the targets within those frames, but then understanding the costs associated with fulfilling mandates to achieve the objectives. What I realized through my career in conservation is that we were trying to address these problems using philanthropy in the public sector, public goods, and the scale of resourcing that we have in those spaces is grossly inadequate. So what we needed to do is engage the private sector, the investment sector, private capital, and institutional capital to get to the scale required. And just to put a finer point on it, in 2011, I heard a staggering statistic from the European Commission. They put out a study talking about the amount of global expenditure being spent actively destroying the planet, contrary to climate and nature goals. And it's over half of global GDP. At that time, roughly $45 trillion a year. Now, at that time, I was working with the largest funders in the public sector and philanthropic sector in climate and nature, had a pretty good sense of how much we were spending actively protecting the planet. And it was about $45 billion. That's 3 orders of magnitude, 1,000 times less. there's no way in any scenario that we were going to solve this problem for spending 3 orders of magnitude less on the foundational infrastructure of the planet than destroying it. So where do we need to turn to? Well, where capital sits. And the other thing I learned through the later part of my career at Conservation International is that it's not across the board, but there are several opportunities that sit at the interface of commercial productivity and environmental progress. And we are leaving trillions of dollars on the table if we're not trying to optimize or maximize both. In fact, there's lots of evidence now that demonstrates that there's opportunities for risk reduction in commercial activities and value creation to extend long-term value propositions in the commercial and investment sectors by trying to optimize both sustainability and commercial value. Now, so those are the economic dependencies that relate to sustainability challenges. Now, many of these approaches that optimize both require thinking more broadly about systems rather than thinking just at the entity, project, or asset class level. And that's where we're going to get into some detail in the conversation today in the next 3 sessions, using plastics as an example. Now, I want to be clear that this isn't a silver bullet. Thinking systemically across the board is going to work in all cases today. There's still a lot of limiting factors, particularly in the policy and regulatory side, on the infrastructure side in terms of intermediaries between supply and demand, on the incentives, both perverse and otherwise. And many of those things still need to be rectified. So I don't want to say that every situation in the sustainability challenge landscape can be solved for immediately by private capital or investing. However, there are some nascent approaches, nascent technologies and approaches today that, while taking a systemic lens, might lend themselves to scaling. And what we'll talk about in the plastics cases is one example. Now, I just came back from Malaysia, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but I want to give a couple of brief anecdotes about the last couple of weeks of where I've been and what I've seen. And it's been a dramatic change in the from the beginning of 2026, I would say, but in the last several years, since we've had the advent of the Paris Agreement and the Nature Agreement, and really understanding sort of the targets and the financing required. So on the nature side, I just want to reflect back and say that we have a good estimate of what the cost will be to fulfill the 30 by 30 targets. The Paulson report in 2020 outlined that it would take about $711 billion of additional capital every year. That estimate varies between 700 billion and 1.5 trillion, which seems like a lot of money, but at the end of the day, it's less than 1% of global capital under management. Now, much of that can be solved for by resolving the subsidy crisis. So a lot of governments have perverse subsidies. So reforming subsidies is a big element in tackling environmental challenges, particularly around nature and climate and fossil fuel production. However, there's still going to be a roughly 1/3 gap that needs to be fulfilled by private capital. Now, what I've seen over time is people saying that's a really big number. Systems are hard. Complexity is difficult to understand and grapple with. And people throwing their hands up in the air. We'd love to do that. We'd love to engage in nature investing, but it seems too difficult. And that's where the last couple of weeks has really inspired me. So I was in Davos at the beginning of, or at the end of January. And one of the things that was clear to me, while we saw in the global news the geopolitical issues and Carney's speech and AI was a dominant theme, what I saw is the conversation around nature really changed from one around, oh, this is a big problem that we need to tackle, into one that was more around nature as foundational infrastructure. And that's a reframing that is really important. And we'll get more detail into that in later sessions. But nature as infrastructure is really interesting because historically we've thought about nature as an externality or as a commodity. If we think about it for what it truly is, which is the backbone of our economy and human society as core infrastructure, then it changes our relationship with it from an investment and financial and commercial lens. And the conversation around investing in infrastructure is very different than investing in externalities or public good or commodities. The second thing I'll say is that the advent of people thinking about systemic solutions in different scenarios is much greater now as well. So two examples I'll share before I turn to Joseph in talking about the plastics issue writ large. One is working with private landholders and private leaseholders. And the reason I was just in Southeast Asia was working with one of the largest real estate developers in the region. And they made their wealth by cutting down forests in Southeast Asia to develop cities, real estate, commercial developments, residential real estate, universities, hospitals. They now are looking to see if there's opportunities to develop multiple income streams while retaining natural integrity. And it's a very fascinating conversation to have with the principal of this family and his daughter, because they have a very different perspective on what land development, real estate development, and the future of their asset base is going to look like. The father, when I asked him about his motivations around property, said that when he looks at a forest, he sees it being cut down to build gray infrastructure in the built environment. That's how you make money. But the other thing he told me, which was really interesting, is he said, my daughter says that it can be done a different way. And if you can help us understand how to do that, then the future of not only that landscape that we're talking about today, but the future of the entire asset portfolio that I have, I would like to transition into that. Because if we can still generate wealth, generate value, while reducing risk and show that transformation on landscapes is possible while returning capital to our investors and our family, then that's a better pathway for us. And we have more and more clients asking us these questions around, is it possible to retain natural infrastructure while creating development opportunities and commercial opportunities that don't compromise ecological integrity? Another example from a couple of weeks ago that relates directly to this challenge is one of the largest airlines in the world came to me a couple of weeks ago and said, we would like to remove plastics from our aircrafts. Now, we'll get into why there's a challenge in doing that immediately in the moment to get purchase orders in place and to get to the point of all plastic bottles and cups off an individual plane or an airline today. But also, we'll get into some of the conversation around why it's not too distant in the future that we can have a reality where that's true. And some of the bottlenecks that Joseph and I will talk about in the plastics transition are directly related to the interest of groups like this that have a very specific idea and mandate. They understand that they can't do it alone. So systems are required. Some complexity and complexity thinking is required, but also thinking across the value chain and thinking across different parts of the plastics ecosystem are required. And the pathway 5 years ago would have been pie in the sky in the future. The pathway today for this airline, I think, is less than 12 months to get to that reality. So with that, hopefully I set some inspiration, set the expectations clear that nobody's safe and there's no free breakfast. We'll turn a little bit to plastics as an example of systemic solutions. And I'll turn to Joseph to paint the picture of the plastics crisis. Joseph?
Thanks so much, Harry, and thanks so much, Audrey and Kayvon, especially for and everyone on the call for such a great platform for convening an open discussion. Much appreciated, and great to hear Harry's takeaways from the last few months. It is very encouraging, especially with all of the negative news we're hearing everywhere, which I think might be discouraging for those managing perception as opposed to dealing with reality, such as those that are in corporations dealing with actual issues, and not just because of the physical constraints, but the amalgamation of regulations globally that's past us, made us go past that inflection point. Just by way of background as well, so we're Calmus Capital, we're based in the Geneva area, effectively doing investment advisory, but with a systemic sustainability lens. And by way of background, it's at the culmination of sort of effectively 20 years of looking at the black and white investment in the alternatives space value chain and having a view on it with a colored lens by looking at how do we scale up impact and what are the transmission mechanisms and how we look at those incentive structures. And that's culminated to an approach that's effectively where we naturally see the way to invest. If we're going to be talking about impact and dual materiality, then we start with the actual outcome, work backwards to what are the transmission mechanisms, what are the solutions, what are the incentive structures, what are the bottlenecks, and then we start figuring out asset class capabilities, partnerships, talents, and then work backwards to how to put that together. And And that's culminated in one of the examples to such an approach to systemic investing, which is within the plastics uh, issue. And rather than sort of creating a fund that's a weighted average of lots of wonderful things and everyone contributes to Trojan ponies, we're just going to say, how do we build that fund platform and launching a fund effectively to start this off for addressing one issue? And this anecdotally started off over a few beers, too many, over a barbecue, speaking with some of the main negotiators of the plastics treaty, a few rounds of the INC before, saying, well, look, we're stuck. How do we get this going forward? And how are we going to be addressing this in a way that gets the oil and gas producers to keep the oil in the ground and address the carbon issue? And it just dawned on me to think that there's not much of an investment first lens that's being applied to the incentive mechanisms needed for everyone around the table to find solutions to how this would work. And digging into it, thanks to AI in grand part, we sort of flesh out the problem and say, okay, well, let's deal with things on a systemic issue. I'm not going to bore everyone with too many slides, but just a few to highlight first and provide a setting on. Can you see is that coming across okay? Yeah. And just to see the scale of the problem, especially given its complexity. I mean, we're talking about 400 million tons of plastic every year, which visually and I think from a harm perspective, on a health basis, we're going to really delve into that into the next session on going into the science of microplastics, which is not that it's new, but that the science of recognizing how bad the problem is very new. But effectively, from a carbon perspective, it's 45 to 90% of the marginal revenue growth of pretty much most oil and gas companies. If we're successful on the energy transition, 95% of plastics is oil and gas based. And at that kind of growth rates, it will be, if not the largest, one of the top 5 largest contributors to emissions and uses of oil and gas. However, the problem with not just bashing it, as we've realized, is not going to work in energy. It's certainly not going to work in plastics. We're better off with plastics than we're not. It's a fantastic innovation. It's a miracle innovation that we've had in the 20th century. Even ecologically, we're better off with plastics than without, given sort of preserving food all the way to having lighter cars. And I think if we look around, we underestimate just how much we rely and are grateful for plastics. But it's a question of how do we manage it properly. And to do that, whether it's the plastics treaty or any other regulation that comes in, it's a bit more complicated than just policy or one actor taking a view on it. So we decided to take a first principles approach to it. I won't go through each of those, but to take a first principles approach, the first takeaway I wanted to build on is if we're going to look at a systemic issue, 400 million tons of plastics globally, we need to be consistent in applying a systemic lens when looking at each of the different alternatives that are applicable in the space. And as opposed to the way that industry and businesses and any silos that anyone on the call or that we know are dealing with, whether it's a particular entity, so, okay, well, we look at one element, build on it, and what makes sense, financially viable, and progress from there. And we come up with a completely different conclusion.
Before we move on, I just want to pull out a couple of things from the first slide that you said, and then lead into this, because I think this is a really important piece. You can move on to the next slide. That's fine. But a couple of things I just wanted to pull out as key takeaways from the first part of the discussion for the group is, one, the plastics aren't going away, right? They're necessary. It's a growth sector in many fossil fuel industries. And there are approaches to reduce the environmental damage, the emissions factor, and the health consequences of the plastics industry today. So that's one takeaway I'd like to say. The second thing that I think is critically important, that a lot of us get hung up with, especially institutional investors get hung up with, when we talk about impact or systemic investing, we often think that comes with a concession. The reality is that if we are going to make these systemic changes at scale, commerciality has to be at the forefront to drive impact at scale. Okay, we can't do impact and then assume that commerciality and scale is going to come behind it. We need to come at the forefront. This is what Joseph said, which may have been lost in a little bit of the conversation, which I want to make absolutely clear. is that we need to create the commercial and investment argument first to pull the impact scaling along. And that's been a critical gap, I think, in the impact investing community to date. Now, to set the stage for this, when we talk about entity versus systemic, the approach to the plastics crisis to date has largely been individual pieces along the value chain, or individual things that are treated as almost this is a silver bullet to address the entire system as a whole. So we can replace plastics with something else, and we've seen that with paper bottles for water instead of plastic bottles for water. We can think about circularity, and circularity is really around recycling and restoring reuse. We can think about decarbonization, so decreasing the emissions load on production, either inputs or on the production side of the plastics. Or we can replace the inputs with bioplastics and other pieces. Now, individually, each of these sounds like a potential piece of the solution, but that's all they are, is a piece. And unless we do things in a coordinated way and think about the system, which Joseph is going to get into in more detail here, we're never going to get beyond incremental and to the scale necessary. So Joseph, go ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for raising the point, because it's one thing you're right is absolutely central to understand is that when we're looking at systemic, it's not just this negative systemic harm. It's that at a systemic level, we should design things which do not rely on concessionary capital, aspirational motivations. It needs to be driven by what makes financial sense for each, not just for investors, as we've discussed in many forums, but for every actor along the value chain, in particular companies. We're talking about the largest FMCGs in Europe, for example, and the larger corporations, and the amount of capex needed, and let alone the inertia. It needs to start with a financial catalyst. And I won't go into each of the different boxes, and we'll talk about CBAM later, but one of the biggest underestimated critical triggers, which will, and this is our investment view and not advice, but it is speculative, but we can discuss offline as well, that in about 3 years' time, there will be a mad rush at an inflection point where all players along the value chain are going to be having a massive financial need to transition to the scale that we've seen in the energy transition. So in a nutshell, CBAM does not include plastics yet. It will probably be decided at the end of this year. I would find it very, very unlikely not to be included. And given the mechanics of the pricing mechanism, carbon pricing, amount of plastics, and the margins of players along the value chain, we're talking about 10 to 20% additional tariffs, which will have to be absorbed along the value chain. That means that business as usual and the unit economics that are currently existing, that causes that inertia for corporations to say, yes, we're doing things on the margin for perception management, ESG. Okay, we're taking it very seriously and we're putting some CVC money behind some new issues. But to actually get the production lines and capex needed to change things, that requires a big motivation, and we'd expect that to be in the next 3 years. And therefore, that puts us in a situation with, okay, well, what are they going to do? What are the alternatives? And as Harry mentioned, we're not going to detract. And if anything, we're hugely encouraging every alternative, whether it's redesign for replacing, circularity, decarbonization, other alternative sources. But the reality is we are in a capacity and resource constrained world, whether it's on a personal entity or global basis, whether it's time, money, or human and environmental capital. So unlike the public sector, where we need to be objective and leave room for every solution to have its space, we think, no, where do we focus resources, align stakeholders around the resources needed to what is the most likely long-term viable solution? And if we're going upstream and looking at alternative bioplastic feedstock, and there are many and great innovations along the value chain. And at the entity level, some are very mature and growing. So if you're looking at it from a private equity perspective or large pools of capital, which can only be deployed on where there is already traction and marginal growth, great. But at a systemic level, we're going to end up with huge trade-offs. If we're looking at just corn, sugarcane, bamboo, any land use, which is where most of the growth is and looks fantastic on any metrics on an entity level, but at a 400 million ton, not that we're going to replace all of it, obviously. Those trade-offs are someone else's problem, but we're doing okay. We said that, and UNCTAD, by the way, have done phenomenal work on this, mapping out a lot of the different alternatives. And then we just sat down and looked at it and said, okay, it's either scalable, but not sustainable at scale, or very sustainable, but not really scalable. It's great innovations in fish skins, but we need to understand the logistics that go behind it. The only one we really found that could be scalable to the level needed and sustainable at scale, and not just have negative trade-offs, but positive trade-offs, if done properly, because there are very major dangers in not scaling seaweed properly, is effectively seaweed, let alone the carbon and biodiversity potential benefits if we do it properly, cleaning up sargassum and a variety of different issues. But when it comes to funding gaps, it's nowhere. It's very mature, fragmented, but growing like hell. And this leads us to, well, what is the issue there? Why is it not going to be growing? And what does the problem there require a different approach from stakeholders on the investment side? Why do we need to think about this differently? And the main crux of what we need to think differently about, and this goes back to what Harry was mentioning before in terms of, well, how we thought about impact investing previously, or how we think in different silos and how we contribute to a problem, is that impact funds or impact investing generally, it's either marginal in some areas in large pools of capital, or where it's dedicated pools of capital, it's portfolios of impactful companies, something which is a bit more, Trojan ponies as opposed to a Trojan horse. And how do we build that at scale to change the battle? And therefore, that comes into thinking about, well, coming from the fund management DNA, it's a question, well, it's not about the actual investments we make that become a portfolio of impactful companies. It's where the portfolio construction itself is the impact. How do we look at the entire value chain? How do we think about what is needed to be plugged in? You could call it a roll-up strategy, you could call it a value chain creation, but effectively it's what cannot be done by any member of any particular silo on their own. So how do we look at the different types of solutions and innovations? And on the third session, we're going to be having Nopla, which is going to be phenomenal in terms of showing the traction in plastic alternatives based on seaweed and how that's growing phenomenally. But what are the challenges there? And effectively, as Harry mentioned, it needs to make financial viable sense for industry to adapt. It's not taking a Y Combinator Silicon Valley approach to VC and spray and pray, hoping one company becomes the next Tesla to replace Ford. It's what are the solutions that need to plug in to change the existing incumbent value chain. And the issue there is performance. And by performance, I mean the variety of different plastics and the performance needs of each different plastics. It's one of the most complex products, whether it needs to be heat resistant at the same time as flexible, food security, as well as cheap and biocompostable and ubiquitous. It's very complex from a material science perspective. But what is the most important if we're going to be able to achieve through innovation the same performance on different plastic use cases is the price point. If we can't get it to the price point that has that massive adoption, it's not going to work. And why is the price point not going to be there? It's unit economics, it's unit costs. And that's where the other end of the value chain is not going to follow through. And again, session 3 is going to be great in fleshing this out, where there's great innovations on the ag tech and more of the nature-based capital that is going to be dedicated to scaling seaweed globally, because there's so many exciting use cases, nutraceuticals all the way to biochar and biostimulants on 40% margins, helping on it's one of the most exciting investment spaces generally. But the supply is nowhere. It's like 0.1% of farming underwater compared to on land, let alone the scale needed to even think this is not insane when it comes to the bioplastics use case. I mean, we're all the way up here on the cost curve before even going down to where we need to be to have the issues then. And obviously, there's going to be many issues such as intermittence, supply, but also the complexity from a scientific perspective. What species, how much of the biomass can be used? What do we do with the rest of the biomass? Thinking on a holistic basis with alternative use cases to make it all financially viable, as well as the complexity of different conversion and technologies and approaches. And then looking at how do we think of the way that the right species in the right places can be combined, it means that we need to rethink in a flexible way about the type of capital needed and dedicate the type of capital across the capital stack to the need, but based on one specific outcome. And what is one plastic use case to the next? But to rebuild that entire value chain, we can't think of impact investing only as a portfolio within an asset class that fits in within a strategic asset allocation, especially when AI is allowing us to disrupt the way and the tools that we use, is to rethink, okay, what is needed at a systemic level and why can this not be done in-house or in one company? An existing fund, would it make sense to just cherry pick the biggest one and hope that, and that's one of the issues that we find, and I'm sure Audrey's probably seen more of the challenges that across the landscape than anyone I know in terms of what works and what doesn't. But if we just focus on one and have the implied assumption that, well, the system will figure it out and we're just going to take the risk that it works out and contributes to it, just capital. We need to be contributing more than just capital and convening all of the various abilities to convening that. But yes, it's a
So
question.
Joseph,
Yeah.
I'm going to pause you there and pull out a couple of things from what you were just talking about, just to capture a couple of salient points that really resonated with me. One that you said in near the beginning and kind of brought up throughout and repeated at the end, which is that the solution can't be conducted by one entity alone. We can't approach these challenges in the plastics transition or more broadly by investing in one company or using one type of investment strategy. And there's many examples of this, right? If we look at sustainability venture, generally, there's a handoff issue. So early venture going to growth stage to private equity to buyout to wherever you go along that chain, it's hard to get to the next phase. And there's a lot of good cash flowing businesses that don't graduate because the VC model doesn't accommodate them. So using an asset class siloed approach doesn't necessarily work for even individual companies, let alone the systems change that we need to have. So I think that issue or that point around siloed strategies, whether by asset class, whether by company, whether by entity, whether by portion of the value chain solution, won't be successful in scaling systems change. Two is a really interesting one too, which you talked about, the Y Combinator model of creating a Tesla to replace Ford. We have thought in the past that we can create sort of sustainable alternatives, or what we conceive of as sustainable alternatives, without thinking about the peripheral effects necessarily that will displace incumbents. In the plastics industry, that's virtually going to be impossible. But we've also seen examples of this not being possible in other industries. In food systems, for example, everybody that invested in the early sort of plant-based meats environment thought that Beyond and Impossible, when they IPO'd, were going to displace conventional beef producers, right? There was great ambitions at the $15 billion IPO for Beyond Meat, but then the market sort of cratered. It's never going to displace, the JBSs and the Tysons of the world completely. It has a role to play, but one company is not going to cause a systems change in our entire food systems, which is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. So we can't think about systems change by focusing on one entity that's going to displace incumbents that have been sort of embedded for generations and have a whole system. We talk about systems from an impact perspective. Systems from a degrading or destructive perspective have been built over generations. Policy systems, regulatory systems, lobbying systems, all of these things act together to coordinate perverse incentives around the extraction economy that we have today. We're not going to turn that around by investing in one company. And then the third point I'd just like to focus in on is price competitiveness, right? So for a company to scale and a good innovation to scale, to get through that J curve, it needs to be not only price competitive, but it needs, in many cases, to be a lower price point for the buyers and the suppliers to change their purchase orders or their purchase behaviors. So in the example I gave about the airline, while early stage technology exists that can remove plastics from an airplane, they are unwilling themselves right now to create the demand signal and guaranteed purchase orders to help that company scale. So your comment about sort of the ability for innovations to get past that cost curve is very salient in that situation specifically, which is because right now their price is not as competitive with the plastic alternative. The way to get it competitive is to invest in scaling manufacturing technology, but investors won't come in to invest in the scaling manufacturing to reduce the cost curve in order for the buyer to come at the back end, unless the buyer is guaranteed and the purchase orders are guaranteed.
Right.
So rather than thinking about it from an investing into the company perspective, if you think across the value chain, and if you can figure out a way to connect the buy side with the innovation, and the investment comes into scale technology and manufacturing in order to reduce the price point and the cost curve to get to cost competitiveness, that's where we start to get sort of some of the systems thinking for an entity level, and then think beyond across the systems level.
100%. And that's exactly what we're trying to design, where it's not just gathering capital from um, aspirational capital sources or those just looking for return, but where there's an extra incentive, players along the value chain, where we want to be able to lever more than just the financial capital, but actually the contributions. And building a platform effectively where you've got the different working groups from the different stakeholders that are required. Going back to your point on, sorry, there's a lot to unpack in that, but it's exactly that line of thinking. If we're thinking very specifically about one problem to solve and how to build it, as opposed to an exposure within a general narrow fund, it it means that the talent stack can be very specific. Having the specific, whether it's advisors or other types of stakeholders that contribute because they'll have the expertise on the R&D in sustainability packaging at the largest players. And looking at the portfolio, they will be in a better position to be able to plug in with the right JVs and the licensing agreements, with the kind of bridge that we need at that layer, as opposed to leaving every single company, no matter how big they are, and no matter how much they raise, they're never going to be able to achieve what can be achieved for them if we think about it as stakeholders and not just investors, that help them get the licensing agreements, get the pilot cases to go through the different corporations. Because it all starts with the offtake agreements, the securitization of the capex, of looking at what is the blended finance models for the right seaweed strains and species with the right offtake agreements in the right places to build that green line. In the meantime, we need to marry it with what are the other use cases that are financially viable, which are further up the cost curve that help to get there. But as you mentioned, if we just rely on industry and asset class silos, and if I were in a company that's just invested in one of the upstream corporations that's picking up lots of sargassum, well, hey, you know what? Getting to Series A and Series B and doing great because you're going to be making lots of revenues and growing on nutraceuticals and biostimulants. I wouldn't want them to be distracted putting the capex into something else. Just grow that, unless there's people on the capital structure and incentives from the market that says, no, here is the guarantee. This is what we need when, and the intermittence issue cannot be underestimated. But also with the complexity that this requires, and hence the title of the sessions, and something that Harry mentioned, I think it was one of your mentors or someone that you mentioned, sort of complex is not complexity, which I found a fantastic quote. But effectively, the way that capital gets raised, yes, 3 bullet points in one email will go much further, but simplicity doesn't sell. I mean, simplicity sells, but it doesn't resolve. And this is where AI is transformational, not because it helps us do things better, faster, cheaper, but allows us to do things completely differently. Because as we mentioned, there's complexity on all facets. So we could look at things incrementally, and that's the way most industries are. You sort of look at one side of the Rubik's Cube, get that solved, get one unified color, move on to the next. By the time you've done five, well, got to go back to the drawing board because you didn't solve the whole thing. We could convene experts in different competencies, but and AI will never be anywhere near as good as an expert in any one competence, but it'll help us understand the details. And that's where we've sort of gone to the ends of fantastic tools which plug into APIs to the biggest scientific databases and looking at what scientific benefits are of specific seaweed strains. So you need the
So
material
Joseph,
engineer. And it's effectively going back to your point, how do we mesh that together to find where all resources need to be convened and convening the different talents to solve that value chain, as opposed to just contribute to what's a good idea, but then hope that the system figures it out itself.
Yeah, and I think that's a fantastic place to pause where we've got about 25, 30 minutes left. Audrey, you have your hand up. I'd like to open for sort of more of a discussion. I might have a little phrase on complexity at what, but Audrey, please,
Yeah,
over to
maybe we just kick off some of maybe one question that will open up to some of the others already in the chat, just to draw your attention to them. From an opportunistic investor perspective right now, I wonder if you could please put this in context in terms of the timeframes around when is this hitting? So you mentioned CBAM. We're expecting that there will be the integration of plastics in the next 3 years, 4 years, which means we actually have, if one is going to be an opportunistic, mission-driven investor, and I know, Joseph, you have aggregated hundreds and hundreds of companies that focus on various forms and types of sargassum, seaweed cultivation, processing, all of it. When do people act? When is the moment? Because as investors, obviously, especially impact investors, timing is everything. You have to know when to come in and when the price is right. I wonder if you could comment on that from the kind of call to action perspective here, and then also address some of the really good questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, no, it's fair. I was going to address Tasha's one, but I'll come on to that just after yours. Thanks so much. 2029. That's as concise as I can get. Let me unpack that.
So 3 years.
Yeah, no, I think being cynical, I think action at the scale needed only comes with mass panic and people at the executive board just looking downstairs and firing people because they didn't think about it 3 years ago and just figure it out quickly. And we've seen those inflection points where regulation is known for 5 years and then it's all talk and tomorrow until the executive board sort of really hits that on the fire on firefighting mode. So using that as a benchmark for when that financial inflection point comes in, that corporates will just look for what do we need to be doing right now. I think the smartest ones are doing it now already. 2029 at a guess. Why? Because I think, and at the end of this year, assuming it gets delayed, but there should be a decision by EU on the inclusion of plastics within CBAM. Give it 2 years of integration of how that fits into the system. And looking at the mechanics of how CBAM is calculated, you're penalized for not actually having done it by about 30%. How does it work? Effectively, and just in I'll keep this part brief, but just looking at the numbers. So if we look at the existing polyethylene, polypropylene plastics value chain, using the CBAM calculations, which is just the production, not the full life cycle, you're looking at about 1.6 tons of carbon per ton. If we project the price of European ETS, and we're taking a view that it's probably going to be significantly higher than today when now that CBAM is in place, exporters are going to do what European companies did a few years ago, which is panic and hedge their forward needs. You're going to get a short squeeze. The ECB might take over, but we're going to see a reduction in the compliance market allowances. But if we assume that we're going to get a price above 100, let's call it 150, and looking at the price of plastic, 1,300 euros on average per ton, and how ubiquitous it is across the system, it pretty much hits at about a 15% premium, and which is absorbable in other industries, but there's a high collinearity. Companies that use a lot of plastic have thin margins, and plastic is a significant portion of their cost. I mean, Nestle, it's about 12%, for example. Lego, a hell of a lot more. But it's a big part of the revenue, a very low margin petrochem export. So mode thinking, well, Europe is a significant part of their revenues. How do they either lose that market or address it by having a transition capex that's required? If they pass on all of the costs to the packaging and consumer companies in Europe, all of which are going to be having margin issues, that's significant on their valuations and is probably hitting the CFOs not right now on steel and so much so on ammonia that they're having to go back to the EU and say, wait a second, we're going to have a food crisis if we don't think about this a bit more carefully. We had 3 years, but oopsie. All the way to the consumers itself, which everyone knows will end up footing the bill, except when it comes to inflation. plastic is a significant enough portion of the cost of the largest portion of the items in the inflation basket. So by 2029, if it all hits the consumer, we're looking at about 40, 50 basis points alone just on inflation. And therefore, you've got an incentive structure from the European governments and public sector, financial incentive, not an altruistic one. You've got a significant financial motive from all of the corporates that buy and import plastic. By the way, 55 million tons used in Europe, 22 is imported, so it's significant. And a very significant incentive from the exporters who are concentrated upstream to lobby the hell against this, which is where political will need to be concentrated, especially the WTO, or put the capex to adapt. And that's why sort of the time frame, I think, and yes, there's many other regulations that are applicable. Global Plastics Treaty hopefully will come in, guidance and convening on where alternatives need to be used. But I think it's also a segue to Tasha's question, which I think is a great one on.
Just Joseph, if I may just add a quick point before you turn to the other question. So one is, Robert, I see your comment here around being price competitive and petroplastics not carrying full externalities. So what Joseph is talking about here in terms of CBAM is partial addressing of externality pricing within the model from a regulatory perspective. So this is where regulation needs to go to help internalize those externalities. Maybe not across the board, but around carbon and in future around nature, because it has a direct correlation with risk and value, is an opportunity set. To further answer your question, Audrey, I would say, and remind everybody that I'm an investor by pragmatism, and to say that yes, CBAM will come in, and the effect of it, as Joseph rightly says, will probably be by 2029. However, from a timing for a private investor perspective, there's a couple of other commercial considerations to take into account. One is that the purchase orders and the length of time to the sales cycle is fairly long for the plastics value chain, and they're also long term. So if you wait until it's required, you might be too late in the company in order for it to be the right time. Secondly, the valuations are going to increase dramatically over time when this becomes a regulatory mandate, which means that your price to purchase an early stage company or an innovator in this space is earlier is better in terms of a valuation perspective. The other thing, sorry, there was a comment. The other thing I would say is that at the end of the day, we are looking at a transition. Regulation is going to drive sort of the scaling of this. One thing as investors that we talk about a lot, and I've heard a lot, and it comes from the renewable energy transition, is that we often talk about FOMO as investors. So if we missed the early stage and got the best price, then we feel like we missed out. There's a bigger barrier in terms of inertia for the investment landscape to get into something. And it's a term that Ashby Monk coined at the advent of renewable energy infrastructure investing. So 20 years ago, infrastructure was uninvestable by institutional allocators. Today, it's over a $1.5 trillion asset class. And the hurdle to get to that point, yes, there was regulatory influence in the US and across Europe predominantly, but it was the first investors that had a different concept. It was the term coined by Ashby's FOMO, which is getting over the fear of messing up. So the first investors are often cautious, but the ones that invest first and have the foresight to look at what's happening in the future are going to get the best prices and the best returns out of these kinds of transitions. Audrey, would you like to delve into CBAM a little bit more? I saw a comment separately, or do you want to move into the other questions?
I think we should move into other questions, but I do encourage people to ask about CBAM. I didn't know too much about it before I met Joseph. So the implications of that regulation would be useful.
I might thank you for your presentation, Sander Epema from Amsterdam. I work with a personal advice on CBAM intimately, Hans van der Loo, or former Shell. But there's a strong focus on carbon alone, and carbon alone is not the solution, right? There's all other drivers of climate change and ecosystem collapse. So in that sense, pure carbon focus is a little bit outdated. IPCC data is in that sense outdated. They don't explain the current heating anymore. That's a side note. From a foundation that we're running for blue cooling to work on ocean restoration. I'm very interested in what you're saying about seaweed. I'd love to connect. I have a great seaweed cutting company that I'm advising. But also I shared in the chat a solution to having impact or a positive impact on the planet and our people. And what's the short-term business model? I've been advising a lot of those impact companies. And from a purely short-sighted financial point of view, you don't always get them funded immediately or not at all, and which is sad. So there's a flaw in the financial system, and we're trying to solve that with UBIX as one of the different solutions to get impact on the balance sheet with new TNFD and CSRD regulations. So in effect, this creates positive effects for the lenders. And it's a grant-like structure, so you will allow IP technologies and sustainable development and other types of projects to be funded. So that's it sort of solves the Rubik's cube from the picture.
It does. Thank you. And not to take away from any of the different solutions. I know that I dropped off and many have mentioned recycling. And yes, the regulations will promote and require the need for recycling on a massive scale, as well as all the other solutions. And again, we can go into so many different directions. That's why sort of the Rubik's Cube visual helps to not sort of lose sight of the trade-offs and complexity needed. But the essential point that goes through many of the different questions, and I hope we can address them one by one, is that it needs to be that the strategy needs to be set out at the outset on a holistic basis, as opposed to every entity incrementally adapting here and there. If we just look at recycling, for example, and we think about at a global systemic dollars to transition, it's going to be much cheaper for everyone if we're able to go as far upstream as we can, where there's more concentrated number of players, and orchestrate and even subsidize a transition without having to deal with all of the downstream shifts, as opposed to dealing with the very wider funnel in one or few regions on dealing with the symptoms. Yes, we will. I mean, recycling is growing, and I hope it quadruples from here, but it's still just 5%. And no matter how much we redesign, and Adela had a fantastic question on, well, hang on, we can redesign and reuse, and we should, and we will, and reuse is probably one of the best strategies. We're not taking away from the great work being done by anyone else on this, and we should. But there's a bare minimum we're always going to need, and the realistic and sort of the reality is, I mean, go in the oceans, it's going to be there one way or another, unless it's whatever is remaining has the time lag needed to adapt to something that is biocompostable. And so I think it's an important point just to go back to that initial slide we mentioned in terms of thinking through every different decisions, how it looks through a systemic long-term lens versus just at the entity level. Even if the entity is just Europe, I mean, Europe can be zero plastic, everything reused and fantastic, and probably save the equivalent marginal plastic of just Nigeria in a couple of years. Globally, we are all interconnected nonetheless, and sort of we need to have that upstream conversion, which is a bit tougher, but requires that complexity to deal and balance many of the different interlinked areas there, which is also why, as Harry mentioned, coming up with sort of like why, as an investment case, it's very exciting, is that the valuations are nowhere near what they should and will be, and they will not get there on their own unless there is that catalyst across the value chain with the right technologies on the right species to link them up.
So there's a bunch of great questions in the chat, and we've got about, I think, 10 minutes or however long people can stay, I suppose. I don't know how long we have the room. Audrey and Keivan will guide us out whenever we need to. But I do want to just point to, Tasha, your question. Joseph, I'll let you respond in a second, but you make a very clear comment about also why we're not looking at a symphony of responses rather than one single massive solution. I think to be absolutely clear, if we think about a systems approach, we are talking about a symphony of approaches. So the challenge as we talk about some of these complex systems issues is that we will go down sort of pathways of individual parts of the system. But the investment case, the systemic investment case, is that symphony of solutions and looking across. I think that's a really good analogy, is a symphony, right? Is that when we think about going to the symphony, if we only had violins in the symphony, it would be a pretty boring show. So complexity by design is inherent in the musical performance that we see and we're inspired by because of the multiple instruments involved and how they coalesce together. And that symphony of responses is similar in systemic investing. We need to think about different tools across asset classes. We need to think about different products. We need to think about different parts of the capital stack, from concessionary to debt finance to equity and others. But it absolutely is a symphony and a coalescence of a variety of solutions across the value chain and across the systems. Some of them are going to have more material impact in terms of scaling the overall systems approach. And I think where Joseph is heading is, yes, like he said, if you scale, recycling 3x, 4x, it's still going to be part of the solution, and it's going to be critical for the systems change, but it's not going to be perhaps as material as looking at the input replacement via seaweed sargassum and the knock-on benefits. It's not to say that one is more investable than another, but investing in all across the symphony, so we have the related instruments in the orchestra.
I'd hesitate on overstretching that particular analogy as opposed to Trojan horses and Trojan ponies, if I may, because definitely if there's no opportunity cost, and there's going to be fish skin waste and other waste that needs to be reused, and there's technologies locally to do that. Absolutely. So yes, everything, everywhere, all at once, all that. But the premise of, if holistically we are resource and capital constrained, and to get a long-term viable solution, we need a Trojan horse. We need all of the soldiers in that one horse if they can't be somewhere else. I think is different to a symphony where you need all of those disciplinary instruments. You do need the symphony of stakeholders because you need all of the different instruments to make that one symphony. But then if you're doing different songs at the same time, it becomes a cacophony. So I think it's the premise of, and again, Audrey, you're 100% right. As usual, people don't want to invest in everything because it's overwhelming, which is why it's bringing it down to what is curated and what makes sense and how to build that building blocks to say, okay, and not just invest in one asset class, but what is the capital needed at different stages and for what purpose and with which conditions, because that drives not just market returns, excess market returns, because that means that you can narrow down the enablers at a portfolio level to something that's very, very specific, because the entire value chain plugs in to how that gets done. So it's not a question of us building a portfolio and see who works out because we're going to sell a thematic fund or people, we've done ETFs or anything that just sells a theme and exposure to a theme, as opposed to funding a solution that plugs in at low to larger amounts. It's not amount dependent, it's purpose dependent. And it's about how do you plug that in with the right JVs, licensing agreements, forward purchase agreements, securitized products. We can have great debt funds. It'll do blended finance for lots of seaweed and then make the assumption that let them all bloom, pardon me pun, but it needs to be the right species. It needs to go for the right, it needs to be, and so if we're looking at designing those debt products, is a question of saying, well, what are the conditionality, because there's a purpose to why that debt is there. It's not just to fund and then hope that capital and will make something grow in mass, and then good luck to whoever commercially goes and uses it. It requires, and that's where AI allows us to do what would have been overwhelming before. It's impossible to go to that levels of complexity if we weren't able to leverage the technology that allows us to have those interlinkages. But yeah.
I'm just tracking the comments in the sidebar here, which are fantastic, and I think I find it really interesting to use analogies from other spaces, whether it's music, which is going on the sideline here, and Audrey, to your point, and Joseph, to yours, yeah, people are playing different songs, it gets cacophonous. The symphony also needs a conductor, absolutely. I would challenge the notion that nobody's willing to invest in the ecosystem, though. That's one of the encouraging things that I've seen over the last couple of years. There are, a few groups with significant capital that are looking at multi-asset class approaches, say builders for oceans and agriculture, for example, and TPC and what they're doing in Asia around systemic investing and different approaches using multiple levers. And I think there's more of and I think if we can show this in the discretionary space, hopefully the institutional barriers within large institutions can start to fall away, and the incentive structures can align to allow for multidisciplinary, multi-asset class approaches to investing in systems. It'll strengthen portfolios across
the way we're looking at that particular point is by not just having a horizontal circularity, but a vertical one, where we're integrating into the capital formation formula, not just because there's phenomenal leading lights like Builders Vision and great asset owners that have a desire for the space to grow and are leading the way in how we rethink it, but have a need. So the pools of capital attached to players within that value chain, because rather than just looking at investors as a pool of financial capital, it's a type of operational models that are linked to the source of that capital. And what we found in many of those conversations is that no matter how big they are, whether it's BASF, who's done phenomenal work, and CVC and trying to fund the space, all the way upstream, they're all within their own silos. You need to be able to go across the value chain because they're all very interlinked, from their suppliers to the regulations that they have to abide by, to what they're going to lobby for, what regulations to adapt, to who their customers are and what their needs are from a technical perspective. So plugging that in, those are the main investors that have a need ultimately for investing in that system. It's not just the aspiration of, well, the system needs to change and everyone on this call and beyond are looking to a better world for our kids. It needs to make financial sense on the motivations for the different players and how they align and go beyond just the financial contributions.
What you see now is that climate risk is being integrated in portfolio management. Absolutely. And actually nature, capital, and biodiversity and healthy ecosystems are the underlying asset class that are now being connected with. So banks are taking a different risk perspective now, that they actually run credit risk, as the report by the Bank for International Settlements states in July 2025. Now the London Bank, the other risk reports are out that credit risk is biodiversity risk, and this week the UK released issued together with China first biodiversity sovereign bond. So which will in turn be able to, with guarantees, be able to fund a lot of funds and impact startups that actually should get funded. And if we measure that correctly with TNFD, this might be a whole new world, and have discussions on building the companies instead of getting them funded, because the impact is clear, right? And so this would be a way out of a financial system that only cares about short-term gains. So I'm very excited. Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sander. That's a fantastic kind of circle back to the beginning. And one of the advances that I'm very optimistic about over the last several weeks is and several months is nature as infrastructure, right? So banks thinking about credit risk is one side of the equation. What I was really encouraged to see in Davos, talking with some of the major banks in Europe, is also looking at nature as infrastructure being considered as a credit worthiness to enhance future business in sovereign cases that are unbankable today, but enhancing natural capital infrastructure in their minds and vision looks toward future business because of increased credit worthiness of those countries down the road and decreased sovereign risk. So risk works on both sides of the equation, right? Reducing downside and potentially increasing upside in terms of value creation, business opportunities, and extension of banking services. And that's something that was not a part of the conversation even 18 months ago. Yeah. So super interesting advance.
And we've seen that in many conversations as well, where it's just, as Sander was saying, sort of the knock-on effect of harmonization, well, not harmonization, but many different regulations falling at the same time. And so we've worked on sort of the PRI reporting framework and how different asset managers need to adapt their operating models to how do we look at the different reporting and what goes in TNFD to biodiversity to dollar. So when we think of people funding systemic solutions, it's no longer the overwhelming going, I'm singing an echo chamber, in the dark on my own. Everyone is on the same hymn sheet, and the different instruments in that symphony are on the same hymn sheet, and giving those tailwinds and vocals and backup singing. I'm going to stop the analogies, but
Well, that's
effectively, whether it's a sovereign level or the different motivations that influence the different components, they are aggregating, and it's financially attractive for investors to now think about capitalizing on those tailwinds by being part of the solution. And so
absolutely. So
that's the most exciting aspect that I've seen in a long time, and pretty much what we do.
I hope we accomplish the feat of demystifying to some degree in this first phase. We have 3 more sessions in this series. We'd love an extension of this group. Very activated. I'm very motivated just by the level of participation, of interjection, of comments on the side. Many of the questions we didn't get a chance to address directly today. Hopefully we'll have similar participation and a consistent group through the 4-part series. Some of the questions on microplastics and whether bio-based inputs are fully biodegradable should come up in the next session around microplastics. We'll talk about specific opportunities kind of in seaweed to inputs and pieces of the plastics value chain in the 3rd session, and we'll come back to have a conversation, hopefully more open-ended and a little bit more integrated with the group in the 4th session. I think I've been inspired by a great start. Kayvan, I think we're at time, so I'm going to turn it back to you just to help wrap us up. But Joseph, thanks so much for the detailed explanations around the seaweed case. And this gives me more inspiration from learning from you all, getting such active participation and insights, and really seeing if we can together in collaboration try to address some of these systemic problems through systemic solutions. Kayvan?
Brilliant. Thank you, Hari. What also has me really encouraged is that we're really good at this. Like the change that we're calling for, we're really good at it. We did it 100 years ago without understanding the full impacts of what we did for plastics. Every beach walk you take, you realize that we got one thing perfect, right? It's ubiquitous. And we can get this right. We understand the impacts much, much more. The tools accessible to us are far more robust. We can make quicker decisions. There is money abound. We just have to target it, right? That's the whole thing. A lot of things are happening beautifully in parallel that create the right incentives. So that's why the time is now, right? So in closing, I'll just simply say that we will follow up with a thank you note that will include a link to this video. You will see coming out to you invitations for future events. The upcoming 3 events will flow at approximately a 3-week cadence, something like that. So you'll have the microplastic session in approximately 2 to 3 weeks' time and follow on from there. And then Joe and Hari will be facilitating those sessions also, and they will round it out in session 4. What have we learned? What are the real opportunities? Where are the gaps? So if there are no other burning questions, Hari has something.
I would just like to say and reiterate from the beginning when I talked about expectations. We're at the end of our session today. Great participation, great work to everybody in the Zoom. Work's not done though. So if you have any additional questions, if you have comments, if you have specific requests to shape some of the future sessions, we're all ears. So you have Kayvan's email. There's ample opportunities to communicate. If there's anything we can do, anything you can do to help shape this to be as valuable as possible. We are a system of people as well. So don't just rely on 1 or 2 people to curate the 4-part series and beyond. Your work's not done, so we're not leaving you off the hook. So anything and everything we're welcome, and look forward to the next 3 sessions.
Thank you all so much. And it's certainly, above all, thanks so much, Kayvan and Audrey, for providing the forum for such collaboration. I don't think the collaboration needed we can need is going to be possible without such long, consistent success that you guys have had. So thank you so much.
Joe, brilliant to climb into your brain. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Have a lovely day and see you soon. Take care.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, everyone. Bye.